And we will also be, most importantly, looking at who is funding Antifa and who is funding these other violent left-wing groups that we've seen perpetuate so much crime and mayhem across our country. Thank you.
Okay, y'all, that... All right, well, first, civil war is for cowards too weak to unite against a tyrannical government and the capital interests that control it. At least left-right civil war. But anyways, that was KKK Caroline Leavitt, White House press secretary, married to real estate mogul. Keep that in mind, because real estate is a central theme of this episode. Nicholas Riccio, talking about how the Trump administration is going to crack down on anti-fascista action. So up next, the FBI to investigate George Soros' dark money funding Bigfoot and El Chupacabra's extravagant lifestyles. So all of this is very fun. I'm glad to not be in America right now. I am currently on the Global Samud Flotilla aboard the veterans boat sailing to Gaza. And I'm actually like 400 kilometers east of you right now, Elina. How are things in Cyprus?
Oh, yeah, they're progressively getting worse, but, there's still a relative calm before the storm, some would say. But yeah, relatively all right.
Yeah, I hear there's a troop buildup of about 250,000 Turkish troops in the north of Cyprus right now. So that's exciting.
Yeah, that's very exciting. So normally there's around 40,000 troops. I mean, that's always been the kind of numbers that Turkey's had to obviously sustain like the occupation up in the north. But now it's obviously escalated. It was 100,000 end of August, and that's 250,000. And it's kind of obviously has to do with the military buildup and the posturing right now that's taking place between Israel and Turkey and their own interests within the region, which Cyprus is becoming a rather essential point of, because, Hamas is in the north of Cyprus, apparently. You got to remember, Hamas is everywhere. And they're also here, and Israel obviously has to deal with the problem in the north, and Turkey obviously has the north. So yeah, there's another point of conflict here and confrontation.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to get into that in terms of Hamas being everywhere. For the record, I have checked under the keel of my boat, and there are no tunnels beneath us, beneath the aid flotilla. So
you can never be too sure, man. You can never be too sure, apparently. They might find a little something. They might make those kind of AI videos. You know how they ones like they made for like Lebanon, where like inside the boat, there's like a little tunnel that leads to, somehow stretches to like the other little boats and then right into Gaza. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, they have an ICBM inside the second story, like guest bedroom. Yeah. So anyways, this is all very fun. And I just want to say, 250,000 troops in, the north of Cyprus is impressive. You're getting up to Kashmir occupation numbers right there. Pretty cool.
Yeah. Fun times.
Yeah. So
exciting times.
So I guess yesterday, the Trump administration signed an executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. Now, within the legal framework of the U.S. law, domestic terrorism is exceedingly difficult to prove. Obviously, the domestic terrorism charges against Luigi Mangione last week were dropped. And, but he is building an extrajudicial police force with the ICE enforcement agency. So who knows? But the executive order is framed in such a way to make any confrontation with ICE into an act of domestic terrorism, which is interesting. I just want to bring this up, while we're all getting warmed up for the episode, designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. Antifa is a militarist, anarchist enterprise that explicitly calls for the overthrow of the U.S. government. Cool. Law enforcement authorities and our system of law. It uses illegal means to organize and execute a campaign of violence and terrorism nationwide to accomplish these goals. This campaign involves coordinated efforts to obstruct enforcement of federal laws through armed standoffs with law enforcement, organized riots, violent assaults on immigration and customs enforcement and other law enforcement officers, and routine doxing of and other threats against political figures and activists. Antifa recruits, trains, and radicalizes young Americans to engage in this violence and suppression of political activity, then employs elaborate means such as mutual aid and community defense, and mechanisms to shield the identities of its operatives, conceal its funding sources and operations in an effort to frustrate law enforcement and recruit additional members. Cool. So, guys, emergency meeting at 11 a.m. at Antifa HQ. Like, this is basically just, a carte blanche to be able to designate anyone as a terrorist. But we have to remind ourselves not to be like reactionary or like freak out because executive orders aren't necessarily legally binding. They're going to go for it. And they're kind of using the martyrdom of Charlie Kirk, which kind of canonizes him and sacralizes violence, and is the lifeblood of violent movements to get that done. But just kind of wanted to talk about that because, everything that goes against the state will now be like left-wing coded, Antifa coded. Like, I mean, they might try to hit this flotilla and code it as like a left-wing action, even though across the political spectrum, people are like, hey, stop murdering kids. So just wanted to bring that up. More developments on that in the future. So, for any action that challenges the ideology or profits of the ruling class, which has determined that the genocide in Palestine is normal, will soon be broadly defined as terrorism. And of course, as I've mentioned, this flotilla is no exception. You will be no exception. The same interests supporting the annihilation of every high-rise in Gaza City to make way for what Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich describes as a real estate bonanza are the same forces that want you to never own a home here in the US and Europe, to rent until you die, never retire, and be imprisoned if you're evicted and or homeless for any action that so rentier capitalism, baby, and whatever they're willing to do to Palestinians to enrich themselves, they're willing to do to you once they can get away with it. So if the Christo-fascists are going to kill you for having a moderate position, you may as well adopt the extreme one and come on in. The water's nice. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that will have a bunch of sweaty, sticky, musty, barely literate ICE officers knocking at your door in the next couple years, maybe months if we're going at this rate. I'm your host, Greg Stoker, former U.S. Army Ranger turned activist and journalist at Mint Press News, joined by regular contributor Elina Xenophontos, brilliant geopolitical analyst that holds the totally non-controversial position that Stalin didn't go far enough. Thanks so much for coming on.
Not exactly. I have my own critiques of Stalin, trust me. But yes, it's nice to be back, and to see you as well on the flotilla, like direct podcast with the flotilla. Good times.
So I kind of got bored. As you can see here, the water is completely placid. There's no wind, so we're under motor. It's kind of like a Rime of the Ancient Mariner status, idle as a painted ship, upon an painted ocean or whatever. But I'm not knocking you on, any of your or anyone on radical positions right now, because after Charlie Kirk's memorial service in Arizona earlier this week, where Grindr crashed for a number of hours, like these reactionary fascists are getting a little out of hand, right? Here's Benny Johnson, conservative influencer and S-tier pick-me girl, absolutely kowtowing before the altar of mediocre white male power.
Describes how God establishes the rulers of the nations. In the audience right now, there are rulers of our land. Represented right here is the State Department, the Department of War, the Department of Justice, the Chief Executive. God has instituted them. God has given them power over our nation and our land. God saved our president, President Trump, from an assassin's bullet for this moment.
And it gets only progressively worse. So there's a lot to unpack here, but we are centering Palestine in this episode. But I really don't think these guys are interested in, stopping the genocide or war in service to capital interest, right? Apparently, we're supposed to now go to war with Venezuela and liberate them from their oil, socialist programs, and rare earth minerals. We're also supposed to retake Bagram Airbase in Kabul back from the Taliban in order to, threaten China's nuclear program and destabilize Israel's next target, Pakistan, and a bunch of other harebrained objectives that will never come to fruition. So there's a lot going on. Israel seems to be prepping for a long struggle against Turkish interests in West Asia, namely like Cyprus and Syria, and its perennial quest for regional domination. So there's so much to talk about, and I haven't done an episode in a while. So some big news, Elina, regarding Palestine that seems good on the surface, but is actually kind of Insidious and happened yesterday and the day before. Let's get caught up on the two-state solution talks coming out of the UN. Al Jazeera reporting.
At a 3-hour UN summit on the conflict in Palestine, President Emmanuel Macron added France's name to a growing list of Western countries.
Le temps est venu.
The time has come. This is why, true to the historic commitment of my country to the Middle East, to peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, this is why I declare that today France recognizes the state of Palestine.
Belgium, Portugal, Andorra, Malta, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, among others, have formally done the same in support of a roadmap for Palestinian statehood, co-written by France and Saudi Arabia. The New York Declaration details conditions for a two-state solution to the conflict with Israel, beginning with the release of Israeli captives and an immediate end to the war on Gaza. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, who was denied a visa by the White House to attend the UN, spoke via teleconference.
We would also like to express our readiness to work with U.S. President Donald Trump, with Saudi Arabia, with France, and the United Nations to adopt the peace plan presented during this conference, within a specific timetable and with international guarantees and monitoring.
Israel's seat at the conference was empty, as was that of the United States. Yet one after another, world leaders spoke of time running out and of the need for the international community to take action, however belatedly.
Without two states, there will be no peace in the Middle East, and radicalism will spread around the world. Excellences,
the conference must mark a turning point. It must pave the way for irreversible progress to put an end to the illegal occupation and to make good on our collective aspiration for a two-state solution.
The declaration, including significant new recognition of Palestine as a sovereign state, is unprecedented, however symbolic.
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer, recently, said in the same breath that, Palestine will never be able to have a military or an air force. So before we get into it, how viable is this? What are your initial impressions? And could you break it down for us a little bit?
All right. So, first of all, we have to also remember that these recognitions have come under the 1967 border. So they're recognizing Palestine, but Palestine is established for the 1967 border, which therefore recognizes the more expansion. It's like land appropriation by Israel following 1948. But furthermore, it, in my humble opinion as well, what does this really do? It pretty much solidifies the existence of Israel, which is, again, it's a colonial settler state on the land of Palestine. It solidifies the fact that a colonial settler state is allowed to survive, and it also pretty much will probably most likely prevent any Palestinian from a right to return into the land that is Palestine, that has historically been Palestine. So what it does is that it cements Israel's right to exist. It doesn't really do anything in terms of actually producing a real timeline as to when Palestine as a state will actually happen. Keir Starmer has come out and openly stated, well, if they're going to have a Palestinian state, if Palestine is officially going to exist, it has to be completely demilitarized. Therefore, they don't even have a right to self-defense, which a normal state, autonomous state should have. And its entire leadership should essentially be sort of taken over by the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority is an Israeli American, basically Western-backed institution and funded institution, which in a way essentially kind of again, it obstructs the Palestine from existing as a sovereign state, from having the ability to right to self-defense, and puts forward this idea of a statehood that again, we've seen this before in the Oslo Accord. If you basically follow this and this and this, these sort of diplomatic procedures, at some point in time, you'll have a state, but that never happens. And so, as it currently stands, it's just another means by which to sell to the public, which right now is outraged globally as to what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Palestine overall, who are calling for the liberation of Palestine, who are calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state. It allows the political class in the West to sort of legalistically and politically, provide this idea that they do respect international law and they do respect the right of Palestinians. But the reality is, what they're actually doing is trying to bring back the Oslo Accords. In fact, it's probably 10 times worse than the Oslo Accords. No Palestinian statehood is actually guaranteed. If it does ever come to be, it's going to be under the complete dominion of the international community. It will never have a right to self-defense, which means that Israel, being its neighbor, if it was to ever be established, will probably continue to abuse its power over Palestine. And furthermore, the 1967 borders are what? It includes, obviously Jerusalem as well as the capital of Israel, which was not the case in the 1948 established borders. And we've seen so much of the territory in the West Bank being taken over, carved out into 167 or more enclaves, so that even a Palestinian state within that kind of paradigm can no longer even feasibly exist. So, I mean, that's just one angle of all of this. And then obviously we can get into afterwards how in reality what this actually does is pretty much set the stage for the Gaza Riviera project and Gaza 2035, et cetera. But we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good segue too. Like, what's driving a lot of this policy is, holding two things in tension. A desire to kind of uphold the veneer of a rules-based order, that, Western powers aren't kind of complicit in this genocide, that we kind of subscribe to our own structures of power that we put in place in the post-World War II era to kind of like dominate the globe, while at the same time serving capital interests and going ahead with these Gaza 2035 development projects. There's I think the Carnegie Endowment what's that think tank called? The Carnegie Endowment for, what is it? International Peace, wrote recently an article about there's actually not just the Gaza 35 project, but there's also 3 other development plans that the Trump administration has been advised on, but they all have a single core thread. And I would like to introduce you guys before we really get into it to the idea of the concept of disaster capitalism. It's a way of, observing this phenomena inside capitalism to really look at dispossession and development. So it was eventually coined by Naomi Klein in her book Shock Doctrine from 2007, but it holds that conflicts, natural disasters, and other forms of crises create an environment for political and economic elites to disempower and dispossess communities, right? So political control without democratic oversight allows these elites to capture and exploit reconstruction funds and provides them with opportunities to grab land and natural resources and to privatize services. Gaza risks becoming another example of disaster capitalism, following earlier examples. Iraq, Afghanistan, which I'm about to talk about, and Lebanon, among others. So it's made possible, this phenomenon is made possible by denying local populations political agencies, i.e. taking in the Comprador Palestinian Authority during and directly after periods of chaos. So this is a first step towards promoting what, geographer David Harvey has called accumulation by dispossession, through the seizure of land and other natural resources while implementing policies of privatization and foreign direct investment, i.e. Saudi Arabia, that deny local communities the funds to invest in their own future or control their political economy. So my example that I witnessed firsthand during the heyday of, the Afghan surge was, it also has ties to Iraq as well, but both countries experienced regime change through wars led by the United States and its allies, which then waged a counterinsurgency campaign over decades to expunge both societies of the influence of their previous governing parties, like the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. And in Afghanistan, a government of pro-Western elites handpicked by the Americans was put in place, instructed by hundreds of international experts and overseen by the donors. The Afghan authorities had no control over reconstruction funds, and 2/3 of all aid was transferred directly by donors to U.S. subcontractors of their choice. So, I think we're kind of seeing the prelude to that general dynamic take shape as the vultures, the real estate vultures, are kind of circling over Gaza.
Yeah. So what I was going to say, I mean, this has kind of been a long-standing position of sort of any sort of critique of capitalism, like even from like as early on as like Marxist theory. Marx even specifically spoke about the fact that obviously when the ability to when there's a capital accumulation crisis that will tend to happen, especially in countries like the United States, the imperial core, or in Europe, for example, they need to find new avenues to create profit-making capabilities. And so in order to do that, destruction, war serves that kind of purpose. And it basically allows for not only just the destruction of property, jobs become basically obsolete. You create a greater army reserve that then becomes easily exploited, therefore creating more avenues for surplus value to be created. But at the same time, it also does this other thing where effectively creates these nationalist tendencies within the imperial core, which then they're able to exploit and create sort of these internalized divides within the territories themselves, or they galvanize in order to push for war elsewhere and distract from, I guess, the more systemic issues that are taking place, which obviously serves the interests of the capitalists, let's say. So, I mean, it's kind of been a long-standing situation, and we're seeing that obviously play out. I mean, that's playing out in Gaza. It's playing out throughout the region. Gaza is an opportunity for a vast amount of investment. I mean, you've got the destruction of a whole mass degree of territory that they want to come into, and they want to essentially establish, new buildings. They want to make out on the Gaza Riviera, the Gaza 2035 project. Like he says, another 2 or 3 or 4 different kind of ideas, but they all pretty much have the same, they have all pretty much the same kind of blueprint. And that blueprint is to privatize Gaza, to set it up to be this little AI hub, to have access to its resources, the Gaza sort of gas resources that it's available to it, but also to create these sort of ports and trade routes that will connect, for example, other projects that are happening in the region, Saudi Arabia's projects in like e-cities, and the way that they're trying to create like the Middle East as being the new kind of center of, technology and artificial intelligence, because it is the center, let's just say, of the planet. It has access to all these different regions, whether it's in, Africa, East Asia, Europe, etc. So it's a very strategically important region. And basically, that's why I said placating the entirety of the region. That would include Syria, obviously Lebanon, which is why there's such a big amount of pressure right now in Lebanon to obviously get rid of Hezbollah as well, so they can establish these sort of trade routes and projects and huge levels of investment will allow them to explore new avenues of investments, and also means by which to not only just accumulate capital, but to cement their own hegemony. So yes, it's going to be a lot of private capital. It's going to be invested in there. A lot of all these big companies, like we saw Nvidia, who's investing in opening headquartering in Israel, because right now Israel is obviously become a new sort of investment opportunities hub itself. I mean, we saw Netanyahu recently. I think there was the 50 states One Israel conference, where he'd basically come out and essentially said that Israel's becoming economically isolated. And I actually had written at that time that this is pretty much a facade. Israel is not economically isolated. I mean, we're seeing huge amounts of startups that are taking place, like at least 4 startups in AI per year since October 7th, with these new startups accumulating already up to 100 million, if not more, several billions in the field of, military surveillance. And the military industrial complex itself is investing inside Israel, because obviously Gaza has become, or just Palestine as a whole, has become this massive project by which a lot of this technology can be practiced and be viewed as battle tested, but also their surveillance operations and how that's going to be exported over to the rest of the world in order to surveillance citizens throughout the entire world, as capitalism is facing its crisis. It's cracking down on dissent globally. So there's a lot of money that's flowing into that. And I think even the UAE entered into, I think, a $10 million contract with some Israeli company, military defense company. Just goes to show that even, again, the Gulf monarchies, although they're trying to distance themselves officially, at least artificially, from Israel, even they have investments, because Israel represents that opportunity. Gaza represents that as well, and so does the entire region. We can get into even more when we're talking about the projects itself, but this is how capitalism operates. They constantly needs to find new avenues to deal with its own capital accumulation crisis.
Yeah. And so, like, I think what's interesting is, like, I've looked at all 4 of these plans. There's the Gaza Futures Task Force. There's, pathways to a durable Israeli-Palestinian peace, which is the Rand Corporation idea for it. Then there's the Riviera of the Middle East, which is the third plan. So all these plans make possible the introduction of three possible principal mechanisms that enable this type of capitalism. The establishment of a governance structure that denies Palestinians political agency and control over their future, a process of land grabbing, resource extraction, and the reconstruction profiteering, and the imposition of security arrangements to enforce the conditions necessary for sustained political and economic control by Israel and its allies and compradors in the Gulf states.
Exactly. Because if you look at, okay, so this is one of the issues as well that I have. When we're looking as well at the United Nations General Assembly resolution that was passed, and it was advocated and pushed forward by Saudi Arabia and France, and it was sort of glorified through Al Jazeera, as well as other specific circles as to how, oh, well, yes, it's cementing the two-state solution, et cetera, beyond the problematic aspect of a two-state solution that we've already discussed. It's validating settler colonialism, and it's still, violates of rights to self-determination, which is a fundamental human right, an absolute right for an occupied and colonized people, by the way, of the Palestinian people. Beyond all of that, the UN General Assembly resolution that was passed by Saudi Arabia effectively states that, first of all, it classifies Palestinian resistance and Hamas as a terrorist organizations, which again violates the rights under the United Nations resolutions up until this point that gave the Palestinians the right to resist, which is, again, fundamental in international law to give people the ability to resist occupation, colonialism, or any sort of, autocratic or oppressive sort of state or regime, which is why, for example, like I've said many times before, there isn't a definition of terrorism within the jurisprudence of international law, because it risks blurring the lines between resistance as well as what's defined as terrorism. And in the United Nations General Assembly, the fact that Hamas was, condemned, understood to be a terrorist organization, and the fact that it specifically requested that the Palestinian resistance, Hamas, of course, being the official name, but all Palestinian resistance fascists have to disarm, have to lay their arms. It's pretty much setting the stone. It's not actually liberating Palestinians, but it's actually depriving them of the ability to be able to push back against colonialism. Every anti-colonialist movement basically was successful as a result of armed resistance, and that's now being stripped as a result of a Saudi-backed, and I want to focus on that because, it's a Gulf monarch state, supposedly cares for the interests, aesthetically, of the Palestinian people, but they're the ones that have pushed forward a resolution that basically commits now, or, under the General Assembly, that Palestinian resistance is acted as in a terrorist format, that it has to disarm, it has to lay down its arms in order to basically allow for an international force, it's what they said, stakeholders, is how they called them, international stakeholders to infiltrate inside of Gaza to provide protection for the Palestinian people until a state is established. This is exactly the same sort of idea that was pushed forward by Netanyahu and he's like the Gaza 2035 plan, but also we've also had, like, from Hebrew media, like Israeli, I think the Times of Israel also published Blair's plans, which spoke about also international stakeholders and actors inside of Gaza, which is what? It's basically occupation of Gaza by international forces and coalitions, which I've been speaking about for a long time, will most likely, be a collaboration with the Gulf monarchies as well as other probably NATO states inside of Gaza, and the Palestinians will be stripped of their ability to even fight for that liberation. So, we can see how that's the first stage that you need, this demilitarized state, in order to then be able to infiltrate Gaza, take control over the territory, and begin the whole called reconstruction of Gaza that will be towards these private companies, cementing their interests inside of Gaza, which means that even more so the Palestinians will be, and their rights to their lands will be stripped from them, as all these private corporations, whether it's from the Arab Gulf states or the West, will come in and basically take over that land and territory on the grounds of, we're just rebuilding Gaza.
Yeah. And, kind of to drive this home and to put it into slightly different language, I want to read my colleague at Mint Press News's statement about, the recognition of Palestine initiative that he put out yesterday by Robert Inlakesh. So he writes, the recognition of Palestine initiative is an insidious trick, and here's why. To begin with, the state of Palestine they are recognizing, according to France, must be demilitarized, and the textbooks will even be controlled by the West, which means this proposal for two states is more or less Trump's deal of the century 2.0. President Macron just said that opening the embassy in Paris will be conditioned on the quote, release of all hostages. Yet Israel already says it won't stop the war with their release. Like the imperialists they are, these disingenuous mass murderers who have aided Israel's genocide demand Hamas cannot have a role in Palestinian politics. In other words, there will be no democracy. They also claim that they'll deploy an international force to help, while the Palestinian Authority will be tasked with disarming Gaza. In other words, civil war, or even worse, foreign intervention and regime change in Gaza that will cost Western taxpayers. Additionally, this force will only be deployed with Israel's approval. In other words, they will be working alongside Israel to do their bidding in Gaza. I could go on, but this isn't a proposal for two states. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card for their Israeli lovers who don't even accept the proposal. However, this is the plan that will go forth if Netanyahu is removed from government. In other words, this is a plan to permanently eliminate Palestinian statehood, to wash away the criminal behavior of Western and Arab rulers who stood by Israel's side this entire time, to incorporate a non-contiguous series of Palestinian Bantustans into the greater Israel project, just as it is working on doing with Lebanon and Syria, all demilitarized, defenseless enclaves who are the slaves of the Israelis. But the world now sees the truth. Your crimes are inked on the pages of history. Your games that you have played since Oslo will fail. So, and it goes on, but, that's kind of interesting because, that's their strategy throughout the entire region. Demilitarization in Lebanon, taking the fangs out of any defense apparatus in Syria. And it's by the playbook, which we have mentioned multiple times, like so many times on this podcast series, that the imperialist playbook is basically just a couple of basic drills that they run through.
Yeah, I was just gonna. It's basically what I've said. It's political ambush as well, because what it also does is that it creates this kind of a narrative, like, oh, see, well, we, some of the Western states now have recognized Palestine, although conditional to basically Palestinians surrendering their right to self-determination, like we said, their sovereignty, and their ability to defend themselves, all of that. But we've recognized them officially. So, if Hamas was to disarm, they would basically have a better future. The war would stop tomorrow. And, Palestine will be on the path to Palestinian statehood. So what this actually does is that, because obviously to any objective, rational observer, Hamas has every right to obviously not abide by this, which Hamas will not abide by this, but the Palestinian resistance as a whole will not abide by this. And this will also be used as an instrument to turn around and say, well, you see, this is why Hamas becomes a problem. This is why the Palestinian resistance becomes the problem in terms of actually, Palestinians achieving statehood. So again, it rids like the Israelis of the responsibility for the continuation of the war. If, for example, Hamas does not, will and should not actually accept to disarm themselves. The reality of the situation is that this isn't going to plan out. The Palestinian resistance isn't going to disarm, and I fail to see. And this is where it's going to get, I think, rather interesting, how they plan on getting the Palestinians to disarm in this hostile, urban kind of rubble terrain at this point. How they plan to even send international forces inside of Gaza, and how they plan to push to demilitarize or whatever, disarm the Palestinian resistance. It won't work. It's not something that's essentially feasible. And it's just going to turn into the situation where you might see, like I think the report that you said just stated, either internalized conflicts, which I don't really see happening within Gaza, if I'm being very honest with you, because the Palestinian Authority has very little to no support, and the Palestinian people do support their resistance. And so in actuality, it's just more of a political and diplomatic ambush against Palestine, its people, and its resistance factions.
Yeah, and we all know why. We all know what it's for. I like to bring up like the Gaza 2035 project is just such a great example of why the stupid like neo-Nazi theory of like the Zionist occupied government really doesn't play out at all. It really doesn't like make sense. There are too many other interests going into this than just straight up ideology and land grab for religion as well. And we're seeing that play out in Lebanon and Syria as well.
It's the veil. They're hiding behind religion. This is something that I have to note, by the way. It's become a bit of a dangerous sort of rhetoric as well within the pro-Palestinian movement, this hyper focus on religion and this hyper focus on, oh, well, it's just the Jews and everything is about the Jews. This actually really feeds into the Zionist argument in order to not only justify its own existence, which is everything that they've, it's the narrative that they've used to continue the occupation, the suppression, and the slaughtering of the Palestinian people and their expansion. But also, I mean, so we saw Netanyahu essentially say, anti-Semitism is growing and, the whole world is against us, etc. I will say this: Netanyahu would love nothing more than a complete attack on Jews within the United States and within the West, because that would actually bring more Jews back to Israel. This has been a long-standing Zionist policy. Before even the establishment of Israel, Zionist terrorist organizations would execute terrorist attacks in territories, particularly within West Asia and North Africa. For example, the cafe bombings in Iraq. Actually, this was a little after the establishment of Israel, but it was these attacks on Jewish communities by the Zionists were done in order to terrorize their own communities, to give them an incentive to move back to Israel, which I think is also very important to also make sure that we don't fall for this, because it actually fuels the Zionist and the Western narratives. But this religious veil that's being used of, the greater Israel, etc., what it really is, beyond Smotrich and Ben Gvir's lunacy, behind the scenes, it basically means a colonial outpost or imperialist outpost in the region that wants to take and control as much territory within the region in conjunction with Western imperialist powers. Because if we look at what's happening in Syria at the moment, I think Jolani right now, ironically, former, Al-Qaeda backed, is in the United Nations in New York City in September of all months. Interesting, given, the 9/11 attacks.
He was. No, like before you go into, like, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just have to highlight the absurdity of it. Okay, so Jolani, now reformed into Abu al-Shara, current president, forever president of Syria. He was on a stage at a conference with General Petraeus, who was, former head of, Joint Special Operations Command, and then he went on to be the CIA director. And people are like, is he a CIA asset? But, like, I don't know. From his release from Camp Bucca just before the 2011 Syrian spring, the U.S. Special Forces successfully, raided Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on the outskirts of Idlib under HTS control at that time. But they didn't kill al-Jilani, despite him being on the most wanted list as well, right under Baghdadi. HTS, most likely, in what we think, received intel, from Turkish Secret Service, and it's very unlikely that the U.S. didn't know about it. Plus there's a Congress hearing about USAID funding paramilitary groups. HTS is mentioned. Time will tell, but this isn't like the rags to riches story. It's a long-running intelligence operation. Again, he was released from Camp Bucca in 2010, along with many other detainees under Petraeus' leadership, because the U.S. presence in Iraq was winding down. The Arab Spring, touched off and stuff, but, like, honestly, the whole thing stinks. And now he goes from being, like, on one of the top 5 most wanted terror lists to now being completely reformed. So anyways, yes, he is now at the UN, being paraded around. And I just wanted to point out some things that are kind of weird. Don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything.
It's a conspiracy theory, though. It's a conspiracy theory. These are facts. This is a factual timeline of what actually happened. I mean, the fact was that he was basically taken in, he was arrested, and he was held in, American sort of camps, let's just say, and he was released just right before the Syrian protests, and he was very involved and somehow maneuvered around not getting caught, but yet somehow kind of maneuvered around, al-Baghdadi of ISIS, etc., who was a sponsor of his. And I mean, we also know for a fact, based on I think it was not Elon Levy, forgot his name, but one of the former Mossad chiefs also kind of went on record on Al Jazeera back in 2015, and he said, word for word, we fund, we help, we provide medical aid to al-Nusra, which is at the time, which basically was the Al-Qaeda of Syria, of which Jolani was the leader of, which means that there was relations between Israel, the United States, and al-Nusra, which then went on to become HTS. And we also know HTS was receiving sort of equipment and aid from Turkey, which is a NATO country, and also military intelligence and weapons from indirectly were being funneled through, apparently, to the opposition of Syria. And we know, even by BBC standards, 82% of the opposition in Syria, which was part al-Nusra and HTS, were Al-Qaeda and jihadist extremists by Western press themselves. So, we know this is not really like something that's new. But yeah, what's interesting, seeing Jolani in the United Nations right now, being sort of paraded around, like you said, speaking to the former CIA director, is it really speaks volumes as to not only his kind of position, I guess, within Syria, but let's just put it very simply. If he was really an armed resistance fighter, revolutionary that was for the Syrian people, he would not be sat at the United Nations with the CIA director, and he would not be so buddy-buddy with the Western imperialist class. He's being paraded around because he represents the interests of the imperialist class within Syria. And what's essentially happening, according to Israeli media outlets at the moment, apparently that we're 2 weeks away from pretty much officializing this agreement, a new agreement between Israel and Syria. And basically what the agreement dictates is the following. The south of Syria is going to be essentially a demilitarized zone that's going to be monitored essentially by Israel. There's also going to be a no-fly area, not a no-fly area, sorry. There's going to be, Israel has secured basically rights to fly through certain regions in Syria in order to be able to attack Iran whenever it wants, and Jolani is not going to do or say anything about it. The buffer zone that was established before, in order to obviously between Syria and Israel, is now going to be expanded and grown, and Israel's going to have a significant role to play in that. And they're going to secure permanent control over Mount Hermon, which, as we've said before in one of our older episodes, is fundamental to the mass surveillance of the region because it's one of the highest points in the Levant. And now this is a very interesting sort of situation. It's not something that we didn't expect. We did expect this, but this is also going to provide, beyond the fact that it's going to obviously, it secures, essentially Syria has now become essentially controlled and completely almost occupied indirectly by the West, by Israel. It is no longer a sovereign state. It's completely become demilitarized. It's becoming completely dependent on this foreign investment, whether it's through the UAE or the West, in order to secure its own survival. But on top of that, Israel is now going to have an advantage in terms of pressurizing the resistance, both in Palestine as well as in Lebanon. So Syria essentially falling into the hands of Jolani, and this agreement not only has been a massive surrender to Syria as a state and its own people, of which, as we speak, Christian villages are burning all over the place, and the sectarian violence against minorities is still continuing at the behest of the West, who don't seem to care. But on top of that, Syria has now become the ground by which to attack Iran, to destroy the resistance, to put pressure on Hezbollah, which already is under a lot of pressure in Lebanon, and it's going to further give them an advantage against the Palestinian resistance as well. So this is where Jolani has served his purpose. This is why Jolani is sitting at the United Nations with a suit and paraded like a hero, because he is a puppet of imperialism in the region.
Yeah. And of course, it's always controversial when you talk about these things about Syria. And we do acknowledge that, the conditions of a lot of people's lives in Syria have improved. But there's still not going to be any independence. That will not be allowed to happen at all. And if he tries to go for it, he will be taken out. And, it's the same playbook in Lebanon now. We're going to arm the Lebanese military not to fight against the Zionists. Tom Barak, the envoy to Lebanon in Syria, who doesn't even speak Arabic or anything. He just said, a couple days ago in an interview that, it's not for them to fight against Israel or other actors. It's against them to fight Hezbollah and their own people. And that's right. Internalized conflict, divide et impera, just like the Palestinian Authority and, forces in Gaza, resistance forces in Gaza, or the Lebanese military and Hezbollah. This is they use the authority of the state to arm groups, official sanctioned groups that they like, to take out groups that they don't like.
This is the thing. So you know how we just said now the conditions of certain Syrians, and I would say certain Syrians has improved. It's also, we have to bear in mind, because it connects to Lebanon right now. I mean, Syria has been in a state of civil war for 14 years, and prior to that, there was an indirect economic warfare that we know from like the WikiLeaks documents from 2000 and I think in 8 that shows a systematic sort of economic warfare against Syria, whether it's preventing foreign direct investment, and then obviously massive amounts of sanctions, appropriation of resources, and then hollowing out the economy in order to basically then provide the grounds in order to justify and obviously be able to overthrow a state. So why do I bring this up? Because now we're seeing the same thing that's happening in Lebanon. What are they doing to Lebanon? They're using economic coercion through IMF, through the bank loans and basically not bank loans, bailouts of sorts for the Lebanese people as a means to put pressure on the state of Lebanon in order to tackle Hezbollah. Now, this is a country, as we've said before, has faced numerous economic crises, with 2019 being the latest one. In the south of Lebanon at the moment, they're being bombarded senselessly for the last 2 years by the Israeli occupation forces. And in doing so, they're bringing about such mass destruction to the south of Lebanon that is actually impacting the state as a whole, because this is a poor country. It's one of the poorest countries in the region. How are they supposed to be able to facilitate to improve the lives of their people, which are constantly being eroded by Western imperialism and obviously by Israel's constant military action against the south of the country? How are they supposed to help come out of that when their country's being constantly destroyed and they need the funds in order to be able to resolve that problem? Now, up until the fall of Syria into Jolani's leadership, Iran would usually provide Hezbollah historically with money to be able to basically fund a lot of social welfare programs that would obviously help in instances like this, instances of crisis for Lebanon, especially in the south, especially with dealing with Israeli aggression. Iran would be able to help provide some sort of financial alleviation from that. But now that's been cut off. So Hezbollah is in a very particularly difficult situation, with Israel constantly hitting and bombarding the south of Lebanon, and they're under increasing political pressure at the moment. Obviously, within the Israeli state, the Lebanese state has also passed a bill that states essentially that they will coerce Hezbollah to completely disarm by the end of the year, which I don't know how they're planning on doing that. And what is the United States offering here? Notice what they've offered, something similar to what we're seeing in Syria. The Trump exclusive economic zone in the south. What is that? That's like another Gaza 25 project happening right there. What they're saying is, expel Hezbollah, you got all this prosperity to come for you. The exclusive economic zone in the south will see basically, it's meant to bribe the people of Lebanon. It's meant to bribe the supporters of Hezbollah, but also the fighters, because they understand that there's huge economic pressures right now on the average working class person in Lebanon that they're going to try to exploit. That's why they're asphyxiating Lebanon economically and continuing the violent aggression on Lebanese territory that is destroying their economic foundations completely, so as to get people so desperate that they will turn against Hezbollah themselves. This is essentially what they're trying to do. And you've got Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the UAE, etc., who are coming in saying, if you disarm, we'll invest billions in this exclusive economic zone, which is yet again the same idea: destruction, private investment into the south, complete control of the territory, that sort of new avenues of investment in capitalism in order to sustain the imperial core.
Absolutely. And just real quick, 1 second, guys, we might be turning the motor off and I will be losing internet for a second, potentially.
Also, I know if I'm losing you.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean that again, we've been talking about that the whole time, and I just wanted to bring up what did I write this thing down? Give me 1 second. Oh, sorry, it's all a mess. I'm just on deck doing stuff, but
we respect you, Greg, for your efforts fighting the Israeli occupation forces on your little boat to Gaza. Don't worry.
Our little non-militarized humanitarian civilian aid mission. Where was it? Come on. Anyways, yeah. So again, really just brings home the fact that, Israel itself is an extension of the U.S. empire to destabilize the region, wage adventurous wars to carve up everyone into vassal states that will allow their people to be and resources to be exploited by Western capitalists. So we're seeing that all over the place, destruction, dispossession, and then accumulation. And I just kind of want to bring this back because I'm still so frustrated that, the American people don't see this as like a transnational war on the working class, which includes them. I just wanted to bring up the fact that a lot of these real estate interests like Blackstone, which, use these kind of chaos disaster situations to buy up all the single family homes in the United States during COVID, are doing the same thing in the UK. They've been linked to both the exploitation of Blackstone specifically. I'm just using this as an example. The UK's housing crisis and what one UN report called the Israeli government's policy of extermination toward Palestinians in Gaza, including the destruction of over 66% of the buildings in Gaza. It's actually higher now. But, two examples one is the purchase of over 1,700 homes by Blackstone in the UK, part of a growing trend of private equity purchasing housing stock to take advantage of rising rents, which figures such as former UN Special Rapporteur Elina Xenophontos have criticized for contributing to rising rates of homelessness, reduced stock of affordable homes, and rapidly increasing rents. And, these same groups, in September 2020, purchased 13 aviation service businesses of the Cobham Group through Draken International, as reported by Aviation Week, Washington Technology, and Reuters. The Cobham produces some of the parts for the F-35 fighter jet program, which has been implicated in the activities carried out by the Israeli government, defined as genocidal by Amnesty International, now the UN, multiple governments, and an array of human rights experts and lawyers, which have involved the destruction of homes, religious buildings, even hospitals. So all these real estate interests are inextricable from the military industrial complex, which wipes out entire swaths of land, which they come in and redevelop. Everyone's talking about how defense contractors are getting rich off Ukraine. What's even more lucrative than sending them a bunch of bombs and Patriot batteries that have already been developed, that have existed for the past 20 years, so they're not having those really lucrative research and development contracts like the F-35 that last forever. Reconstruction, post-war reconstruction is one of the most lucrative, bottom line business enterprises, period. So these
and finance capital
and
finance capital firms as well.
Yeah,
because
so,
people are borrowing money to be able to get by, because it's been such a destruction of basically fundamental resources and industries. People are basically pulling out, not just people are pulling out more money, but states require financial assistance. That means that a lot of these centralized financial institutions, some of these biggest financial institutions in the world, are making money because that's how finance capital operates. So that's another angle to it. All in all, they're making money off of the backs of the working class in the West, that is being gradually depleted, as well as everybody else, which is why, like you said, there needs to be an understanding that this is a war on the international working class. It's not just, what's happening in West Asia or what's happening in Ukraine. It's a collective effort that is exploiting everybody.
Yeah, because we are this policy, is still determined by the state, same transnational business and security elite. The same ones that lobby domestic policy in the United States and the UK and European countries are the same one lobbying for the similar actions to happen in terms of foreign policy in the global South, on the periphery. So this is why I really like, in times like these, the Kwame Ture quote, activists mobilize for issues like pro-Palestine, but revolutionaries organize against systems. Because if you can't use what's happening in Gaza and the cover given by the UN two-state solution to demonstrate what the F is actually going on and what is actually controlling the levers of power and determining policy, it's capital interests, man. All transnationally colluding across the Atlantic, from North America to Europe to the Gulf states, all together to be we need to absolutely denude the Gaza Strip of human life so we can start over, because it is the real estate opportunity of a generation. And also, what's up with those untapped natural gas reserves on the Gaza Marine Basin as well? We can't build oil derricks and pylons, if someone's going to shoot rockets at them. So
exactly. And the same thing applies to Iran as well. Of course, they want to get their hands on Iran, not just because Iran itself is a powerful sort of source that has been funding the resistance and has prevented imperialism from kind of cementing itself and integrating itself completely in West Asia, but also Iran, if it was to be toppled tomorrow, beyond the fact that it's obviously, as I've said multiple times before, central to like the BRI, the BRICS projects, and all these alternatives to, I guess, the Western more dominated institutions. Beyond that, it's a massive country with an abundant amount of resources and huge investment opportunities in a country that has been effectively economically sanctioned and depleted gradually over time, although they've proven themselves to become self-sufficient and resilient. But still, there's a huge amount of investment opportunities that would be available if, for example, there was regime change in Iran. These are some of the things that, people need to understand. Like when it comes to, what's happening in the region, I agree with you. Like people need to understand this is about a transnational kind of capitalist ruling class. Because another thing as well, the Arab Gulf leaders, they're some of the biggest lobbyists, for example, even in the United States. But nobody really discusses that. Why? Because they have vested capital interest in the dollar, in US finance capital. And so, as you can see, it's not about religion. It's not about race or anything along those lines. It's about the people who own the means of production and how they're going to exploit it, and they belong to a particular class. And the rest of us, well, we're just collateral.
Rent till you die, and if you can't rent, you can go into prison and give us slave labor for 5 cents an hour to literally pick cotton in the South. Like there are prisons in the South with predominantly black populations, and they are forced to pick cotton. So if you need any more, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I just think I don't know. I'm still kind of particularly horrified because I first learned about this colonialism and the expression of imperialism and imperial violence abroad in college. Well, I mean, obviously I was part of the spear tip when I was in U.S. Special Operations in Afghanistan, but I didn't really understand it. And I thought that level of genocidal settler colonialism, for natural resources and land and development only really existed in at that level in the history books, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. But it's absolutely shocking. And every day I'm more and more aghast. Not really. I kind of get it now that it kind of still exists at the same fervor and tempo and level of impunity that it always has. And I think a lot of people are kind of wrestling with that.
Yeah, this is why I try to tell, and I've kind of voiced that on my own personal work and the discussions that I've been having. It's very important to not just simply be activists or just engage in sort of violence for violence sake. This is why it's important to understand, to have if we're going to speak about, having sort of armed resistance or pushing back against the state, there needs to be a fundamental ideology that challenges the system, because just activism alone or on one singular topic or just supporting any sort of, reactionary kind of situation in any particular state that isn't ideologically driven isn't going to deal with the core of the problem. And the core of the problem is the system itself. The core of the problem is how capitalism operates, its parasitical nature, and its need to destroy everything in order to recreate and basically, impoverish as many people as possible in order to constantly fuel itself. And so if there's just simply activism towards one particular, problem. For example, what's happening in Gaza right now, the genocide, it's a symptom of a greater problem. It's no different to what's happening in Venezuela, for example, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening, in different parts around the world. I mean, we're seeing right now, I guess, Trump using the pretext of narco-terrorism, which is kind of the new thing. It's like the new, war on terror now. That's narco-terrorism. It's kind of
we've now got Antifa liberal arts students who weigh 120 pounds, lumped in the same category as hardened cartel hitmen. But yeah, cool.
Yeah, it's kind of, we've seen the same thing happen. We saw the same kind of excuse, Vietnam had struck, the whole fabrication related around Vietnam in order to justify an invasion and the onslaught of 3 to 4 million people, which I could classify that as some form of genocide. Because obviously they had their own imperialist interest in the region. It's the same thing happening over and over again. Gaza is just another manifestation of that. So if we don't start identifying the structural issues, and that is the system itself, then we're not really going to get the change that we want, and that people who are very well intentioned want. They want fairness. They want justice. They don't want to see people being slaughtered and exploited. But if we don't start seeing and putting the dots together, well, we're not going to achieve the sort of change that we need. Let's just say.
Yeah. Well, so the engine just turned off. We might lose internet connectivity. Oh, okay.
I like the enthusiasm on your face as well about I might just like.
Well, no, we were just kind of wrapping up. I thought it was interesting that you brought up the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was the false flag attack on a naval ship off the coast of Vietnam, which started the war. And we're kind of seeing the repeat of the same thing. I saw this meme about like moving U.S. naval assets off Venezuela, and it's called the Gulf of Trumpkin now.
Oh, did they? Oh, I didn't see that. That's a good one. But I mean, it's
funny.
kind of the same thing. It's kind of the same thing. This is what I wouldn't be surprised tomorrow they would say like, oh, our ships were attacked, and to justify like some actual military invasion or on Venezuela, which is a country that again is suffering from immense levels of poverty as a result of Western sanctions. I mean, we have so many reports now by UN special rapporteurs, and I think it was even Jeffrey Sachs that published a report that found that due to sanctions imposed by the U.S. on Venezuela, we saw something around 40 to 60,000 people dying per year, and that is a conservative estimate since 2016 as a result of sanctions. So you know what I mean. And then on top of that, now having some sort of military pressure by the United States on the pretext of narco terrorism. It's the same formula that we've seen over and over again, and it's because they want to tap into Venezuela again, massive market, the world's largest, richest country in oil that they want to have control and access over, and again, major investment projects inside Venezuela that they can exploit because they have a crisis in the imperial core. So they need to find, again, like I said, new ways by which to galvanize and make profits for themselves by exploiting these states and keeping them poor at the same time.
They're all in the club and you're not in it. So stop bootlicking for the corporatists and the oligarchs, please. Yeah. And so basically the only So basically the only path forward is like international solidarity, because if you can't see by now, over the past 2 years of watching a genocide and the same actors perpetuate it, both like by denuding, as I said, the Gaza Strip of all human life for redevelopment. They're the same people that bought up all the property in Altadena, the somewhat wealthy black neighborhood in California that was burned down in the wildfires. They've been trying to get their hands on that property and gentrify it for decades. But like they had not necessarily massive wealth, but they had generational wealth in their houses, and they would not sell, and it burned it down. And then they bought it all up. This is the same playbook again and again and again. And I love to talk about real estate because, again, when it comes to the Zionist occupied government theory, hey, the biggest bipartisan lobby sure shit ain't AIPAC, and it's definitely not CUFI, Christians United for Israel. It may just be the multifaceted real estate interests that dominate policy. So cool.
What a positive. I mean, to be honest, I get told on multiple occasions that, oh, Elina, give us some good news, or this is negative. I'm like, listen, at the end of the day, our job as well is to help people identify the particular issues so that they don't fall prey to the misconceptions and the misdirections that, all these counter tendencies that capitalism tends to use in order to distract people from unifying together, and to make sure that we're also identifying that what these so-called concessions are meant to do, and that is to placate and to temporarily and superficially appease. For example, the whole situation with the recognition of Palestinian statehood, and people said, oh well, Elina, this is a bit of a win, isn't it? And I always try to remind people effectively that it's not really a win when you start to break it down. And we always have to try to teach people these small little incremental issues that they need to identify in order to understand the system itself. But yeah, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I do think people are waking up. So it's not just like free Palestine. It's, death to BlackRock or whatever. Yeah, just expand it. Climate activism, ICE abolition. Just get real intersectional with it, because they're all part of the same system of hierarchical pressure, oppression, and coercion. So that's cool. Yeah, so we've stopped here we're kind of taking a pause, but I haven't taken a shower in like a week, so I'm gonna go jump in the ocean real quick. We're like we're like 50 miles out from land, so that's gonna be fun. But like, look at this guy. See, that's a positive note. You know, we haven't completely turned the planet into a radioactive wasteland yet, and there's still time to stop it. You know, before these corporations fulfill their fiduciary responsibility to boil the seas and maximize shareholder value. So, Elina, thanks so much for coming on, and maybe I can do one more episode before we get attacked by our favorite military, the most moral military in the world. So we'll see, guys. Thanks so much for watching. And if you made it to the end, give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because we're almost at 1,000 5-star reviews, and that'd be very cool. All right. So again, I'll put Elina's socials in the comments so that you can follow her if you don't already. And I will see you on the next one. Cheers, y'all.